Ukraine is able to hold on. It has sufficient munitions and weaponry until the early summer. Plausibly can go longer, depending, of course, on how Russia continues its slow grinding war. So in the short term, not too much, but it's certainly a signal that Trump is trying to put the screws on Zelensky. We saw that last week as well in the Oval Office. And we certainly know that Donald Trump has decided that a deal has to be done, and it's difficult to coerce Russia. It's far easier to coerce Ukraine, and that's what he's doing. So it's very much part of the Trump ploy in order to get Ukraine to the negotiating table and to accept a lot of what Donald Trump and I suspect the Kremlin have already decided on. Putin believes he's had the upper hand in Ukraine for a long time, that he is winning this war, that Russia has the capacity because, firstly, the West is going to get bored. He's been very clear about that. Unfortunately for him so far, the West hasn't got as bored as he would like. But he believes that he is slowly grinding down Ukraine. He will receive information that puts the Russian army in a very good light. We see this constantly in terms of claims by the Russian Ministry of Defense that they've taken control of towns that they haven't. So he will be receiving information that may not actually fit into reality. It's plausible Zelensky will be doing the same. But certainly, I think Putin believes that he can win this war, that eventually the West is going to get tired and not support Ukraine, and he will be able to turn around to his public and say that we have defeated NATO, that we have won this war. And as it turns out, Donald Trump seems at the moment to be providing an awfully good number of concessions for Putin. I think Europe has been very clear that it's not ready to defend Ukraine, take the lead. In terms of what we've seen from Sir Keir Starmer, and what we've seen from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, they're talking a good game in terms of putting soldiers on the ground or creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine, supporting Ukrainian cities like Odessa, Kiev, Kharkiv, where have you. But they've all been very clear that we need the Americans to be involved. We need the American stopgap. We need American intelligence. We need various other parts of support from America. Yes, we can just about accept that it wouldn't be an Article 5 infraction if NATO troops were to be attacked in Ukraine, but we would need to know that the Americans will be there to ride in if necessary. So it will be very difficult for Europe to play the lead in any military game, let's say, in the next decade or so without American support in the background. It may force, and hopefully will force, the Europeans to finally decide that we need to actually up our game. And as Emmanuel Macron has said, we need to spend 200 billion euros on weapon systems and various things. But a lot of that will be off the shelf as well, at least in the first few years. And if Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky don't have a good relationship, then it's quite possible the American president will not willingly sell weapons to the Europeans, knowing that they will eventually end up in Ukraine. That's always a possibility as well. So it's certainly a very delicate balancing act at the moment for the Europeans. Ukraine needs to be. It's difficult to say Zelensky needs to go and talk to Donald Trump because Zelensky has been a fantastic wartime president, and it's unfair to say that he needs to do anything. But certainly, in terms of trying to rebuild that relationship, there needs to be something needs to be given in terms of acquiescing to Donald Trump, at least on the face of it, similar to what Sir Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have done. Sit there, nod along, and then hopefully ignore it because Donald Trump has got his media victory, the ring has been kissed, he is effectively a mafia boss, and perhaps that's something that Zelensky will have to grin and bear in the near future. Well, I don't know what could necessarily trigger an escalation. I mean, Donald Trump has said that Putin wants peace. We've seen 3,000 attacks since Donald Trump said Putin wants peace. 56 Ukrainian civilians have been killed, probably far more. It may even, the last report I saw, I think, was 75. So you can imagine that there have been a lot more killed. It's quite clear that there is a continual green light by Washington talking about the possibility of lifting some sanctions against Russia, the possibility of finding a peace agreement where Donald Trump can sit down to the arbitration between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. There may be a European representative there, perhaps Georgian Maloney or Kaya Kallas, although that's unlikely. But ultimately, Donald Trump is in the moment of peace negotiations, and wanting to find a solution will win him the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think the Kremlin has received a lot of green lights recently. This will be yet more confirmation that Donald Trump does not really care about Ukraine, and that he's willing to let Ukraine go, to give it to Russia if necessary, in order to get the peace agreed to. Whether the Ukrainians and the Europeans want to accept it and do have the capacity to fight, that remains to be seen. Ukraine and understandably has, for the last 3 years, built up its military infrastructure in terms of being able to provide for itself, but it still requires American support. I think that the American support is critical primarily because of the intelligence being shared. A lot of the resources that Ukraine uses, yes, it has its own munitions. Yes, it relies on the Europeans as well, but a lot of the best material is American, and therefore requires American intelligence in terms of radar, in terms of satellite imagery, these sorts of things. I'm not saying the Ukrainian front line will collapse. The Ukrainians have fought a war for 11 years and with very little support from outside and done very, very well. So they have a capability that is something that Western governments have simply not had at the same time. They know how to fight a war. They know how to fight the Russians. They will continue. Now, whether the front line collapses, I'm not necessarily certain that's the case, at least in the short term. Possibly not, unlikely in the medium term, in my opinion. Ukraine also will not have access to HIMARS. It'll be less likely to be able to fire into Russian territory. So a lot of the oil depots that have been destroyed, they will be hard to hit. Ukraine may have to rely on Scab missiles from France and Britain. If Friedrich Merz does become Chancellor of Germany, they may provide towers, but this would certainly become harder in terms of they're not as accurate as HIMARS. More importantly, for Scalp, they also rely on American satellite imagery. The big problem, perhaps, is what happens to Starlink. If Elon Musk decides that Zelensky is corrupt, a dictator, as he said before, and that this means, and he wants peace, all of which he said, then Musk may take away Starlink, in which case the Ukrainians are in trouble, because they rely very heavily on their intelligence gathering and also on their communications on Starlink. That at the moment is paid for by the Pentagon, but the Pentagon is now controlled by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. So that may also be a decision that the Americans make in the near future as to stopping Starlink, in which case the Ukrainians do have a problem. I think Donald Trump does things that benefit himself. Yes, a lot of it, he is fixated, it seems, on peace and trying to get peace as quickly as possible. That doesn't involve actually talking to the Ukrainians and finding out what they want. He has said a lot of things that are Kremlin talking points, but in fairness, he's been saying them for a long time. So whether there is this link, I don't believe the conspiracy theories. There's a point Trump as a possible KGB agent or KGB asset or something, or there's compromise blackmail on him from the FSB about what he got up to in a bed in Moscow. Who knows what those rumors are, but certainly he has put himself out there as looking an awful lot like someone who is trying to get peace as quickly as possible, and that generally means coercing Ukraine into a peace deal that is beneficial for Russia, but will look beneficial on the face of it for Donald Trump. The Ukrainians can keep on, for the most part, until the summer, and this will be a difficult decision that will be made by Kiev. Will have to make the decision: does it need America in this war? Potentially, yes. In which case, it's going to have to go back to Donald Trump with concessions and bite the bullet. It will need a public apology, which Zelensky, understandably, does not necessarily want to do because it will make him look weak, and Ukraine look weak. It will require having to kiss the ring, as it were, of Donald Trump. So it depends entirely on what the Ukrainians want out of this. It also depends on what the Europeans are able to give them. Now, whilst I said that the Europeans do rely on American intelligence, and Ukraine, for its best armaments, does rely on the Ukrainian American military, it can still survive by relying on European support. Now, the Europeans may have to buy off the shelf from America. If that's stopped, that's also going to be hard. But in terms of, does it benefit Vladimir Putin? At the moment, I think potentially the Russian army isn't breaking through the front line. It's still sending in meat assaults. It's still slowly grinding its way through Kursk, Russian territory, and the Donbass, which isn't Russian territory, apart from Putin. So at the moment, the line is not breaking. And at the moment, the sanctions are still happening. They're being tightened, and Ukraine is being supported militarily by the Europeans. It entirely depends on whether the Ukrainians decide to go back to America and to sign the resources deal and apologize for what happened and mea culpa. And perhaps that may lead to Donald Trump actually supporting Ukraine, because even J.D. Vance yesterday was quite clear. Once the economic agreement is done, that gives Ukraine security guarantees. So they're still talking about the economic agreements. So that may be on the cards as well. We simply don't know at the moment. But does Putin believe that he is winning this war? He's believed that for a long time. That eventually the West is going to get bored and push Ukraine into a peace deal that will benefit him. He doesn't want a ceasefire. He doesn't want a peace deal that doesn't mean a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. So this is something that I think will eventually come up against Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants a quick deal, but he doesn't necessarily want to hand Ukraine on the silver platter. It would make America look weak. They are still opposed in terms of what the Americans want and what the Russians want. And that, I think, is still something that can help Ukraine. I think the Ukrainians at some point are going to have to do a Macron and go and apologize in order to try and get the Americans back on side. There will be, but what I think we've seen that even the Republican Party has started to see that actually Donald Trump is too pro-Russian. They will start to worry about the midterms, which are coming in 2026. And there will start to be, I think, a keep backtracking by the Republican Party, so they may be able to meet in the middle. I think this is a way for the Americans to show that they are still in charge. And it's now just a wait and see game, as it were. The Ukrainians will almost certainly have to say sorry publicly, but whether that should be enough for both sides to come back together. What that public apology will be remains to be seen. This is an administration that relies very heavily on Truth Social and Twitter, so it could just be Zelensky saying thank you to the American people, as he already did. I don't necessarily think that Putin is jumping for joy in Moscow. He must be aware the Ukrainian army still has sufficient resources, and it's quite clear, at least coming from the Kremlin propaganda, that they're worried about the Europeans actually uniting for the first time against and supporting Ukraine. And the Europeans also having a united front, which may push Trump to actually acquiesce to maintaining support for Ukraine, at least on the side, so long as Ukraine signs the economic agreement over natural resources.